The coldest nights don't reveal who has money. They reveal who still has a heart. Rain hammered the streets of Manhattan, turning the sidewalks into rivers of reflected city lights. People rushed past beneath umbrellas, eyes fixed forward, too busy to notice the woman sitting alone at a nearly empty bus stop. Victoria Hale stared at the pavement as tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. Her dark coat was gone, left behind somewhere during the worst night of her life. Just hours earlier, she had stood in a boardroom on the top floor of the most powerful tower in the city. Now she sat shivering beneath a flickering street lamp, feeling smaller than she had in years. No one stopped. No one asked if she was okay. Then a voice broke through the storm. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Victoria looked up. Standing a few feet away was a man who looked like he had lost everything. His beard was untrimmed, his boots worn, and his clothes carried the marks of too many nights spent outdoors. Yet there was something steady in his blue eyes. Something kind. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her trembling voice betrayed her. The man glanced at the rain, then at her shaking hands. Without hesitation, he slipped off his old brown jacket. It was clearly the warmest thing he owned. "Here," he said, holding it out. Victoria blinked in surprise. "No, you need it." He smiled softly. "Maybe, but nobody deserves to disappear in the cold." For a moment she couldn't speak. The jacket looked old, the elbows worn thin, but when he draped it over her shoulders, it felt warmer than anything money had ever bought. "Thank you," she said quietly. "What's your name?" The man shrugged. "Ethan. Just Ethan." A bus approached in the distance, headlights cutting through the rain. Victoria reached into her purse, wanting to offer him something, but Ethan stepped back. "Keep the jacket until you're home safe." "How do I return it?" she asked. He laughed softly. "Life has a funny way of returning things." Then he turned and walked away into the storm. Victoria watched until his silhouette disappeared among the glowing city lights. She didn't know it yet, but the homeless man walking into the rain had just changed her life. And Ethan Miller had no idea that the woman wearing his only jacket was Victoria Hale, the billionaire CEO whose company owned half the skyline around them. More importantly, he had no idea that inside the pocket of that jacket was something that would make her search every corner of the city to find him again. The rain followed Ethan long after he left the bus stop. By the time he reached the edge of an industrial district on the west side of the city, his shirt was damp and the cold had settled deep into his bones. He climbed into the back of an aging delivery van parked behind a closed warehouse and pulled a thin blanket over himself. The van was not much, but for the past 8 months it had been the closest thing he had to a home. A small flashlight hung from a hook near the door. A plastic container held a few cans of soup. Beside them sat a worn sketchbook wrapped carefully in a grocery bag to protect it from moisture. Ethan stared at the ceiling for a long moment. He could still see the woman from the bus stop. There had been something unusual about her. Not the expensive watch she wore or the polished way she spoke. It was the sadness in her eyes. It reminded him of how people looked when they had lost something they could never replace. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria stepped out of a private car and entered the marble lobby of Hale Tower. The security guards greeted her immediately, but she barely heard them. Her mind remained fixed on the stranger who had given away the only jacket he owned. She rode the elevator to the penthouse level and entered her apartment overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Normally, the view comforted her. Tonight it felt empty. She carefully removed Ethan's jacket and placed it on the kitchen island. The fabric was old and faded. One sleeve had been repaired by hand. Victoria ran her fingers across the stitching. Someone had taken care of this jacket for years. She reached into the pocket, hoping to find an address or phone number. Instead, her fingers touched folded paper. Curious, she opened it. Her breath caught. Inside was a detailed architectural sketch. Not a rough doodle, but a professional design. It showed a modern housing complex with community gardens, childcare centers, job training rooms, and affordable apartments. Across the bottom corner was a handwritten note. "Second door project. Everyone deserves another chance." Victoria stared at the drawing. She had spent years reviewing billion-dollar development proposals. Yet this simple sketch carried more heart than most presentations she had ever seen. Turning the paper over, she found a name. Ethan Miller. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city her company had helped shape. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness. Somewhere out there was a man sleeping in a van while carrying ideas capable of changing lives. A man who had given away his only jacket without asking for anything in return. Victoria looked down at the sketch once more. Something inside her shifted. Tomorrow she would begin searching for Ethan Miller. What she did not know yet was that the path leading to him would force her to confront a painful truth about her own empire and the role it had played in the collapse of his life. Ethan woke before sunrise as he always did. The city was still quiet, wrapped in the pale blue light that came just before dawn. For a few seconds he forgot about the cold. Then reality returned. The blanket had slipped during the night, and the temperature inside the van felt only a few degrees warmer than outside. He sat up slowly and rubbed his hands together. Another day, another search for work, another battle to stay invisible in a city that seemed determined to look past people like him. After washing up in a public restroom a few blocks away, Ethan walked toward a construction site where temporary laborers sometimes found work. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby food truck. He glanced at the menu and kept walking. The cheapest breakfast cost more than he could spare. At the construction gate, a supervisor scanned the small crowd. Ethan stepped forward and offered his experience. "I was a project engineer for 12 years, he said. The supervisor barely looked up from his clipboard. "We are hiring laborers, not engineers." "I can do either." The man finally raised his eyes. His expression changed the moment he noticed Ethan's worn clothes. "We are full." Ethan nodded quietly. He had heard those words many times before. 20 minutes later, 2 other men arrived and were immediately allowed through the gate. Ethan did not argue. Pride had never put food on the table. He simply turned and walked away. Across the city, Victoria sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by executives discussing quarterly reports worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet her attention remained fixed on the folded sketch resting beside her tablet. During a pause in the meeting, she looked toward her chief assistant. "I need information on someone." The assistant blinked. "A potential partner?" "Not exactly." Victoria slid the paper across the table. "His name is Ethan Miller." The assistant studied the sketch. "An architect?" Victoria hesitated. "I am not sure anymore." By noon, Ethan found temporary work unloading supplies at a small warehouse in Brooklyn. The pay was modest, but it would cover a few meals. For 4 hours he worked without complaint. Then a manager noticed the van parked outside and asked questions. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan was told the position was no longer available. He knew the real reason. Employers liked experience. They did not like homelessness. That evening, exhausted and carrying only a small paper bag with groceries, Ethan returned to the parking lot behind the warehouse. But something felt different. A black luxury sedan sat near the entrance. The vehicle looked completely out of place among the rusted trucks and cracked pavement. Ethan slowed his steps. At that exact moment, several miles away, Victoria received a call from her assistant. "We found him." Victoria rose from her chair so quickly that the room fell silent. "Where?" The assistant gave the address. Victoria looked out the window toward the sprawling city below. For the first time in years, a business meeting no longer seemed important. Somewhere in that city was a man carrying a dream called Second Door. And tomorrow, she intended to meet him face to face. The next morning arrived with clear skies for the first time in days. Ethan sat on the edge of his van drinking coffee from a paper cup he had bought with the last few dollars from yesterday's work. The warmth lasted only a moment before the autumn air reclaimed its place. He unfolded the sketchbook resting beside him and opened to a familiar page. The drawing showed the Second Door project in greater detail. Apartment units, community gardens, classrooms, a place where people could rebuild their lives instead of merely surviving. Ethan stared at the lines quietly. Years ago, he had believed the project would become real. Years ago, he had believed many things. The sound of tires rolling over loose gravel pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw the same black sedan from the night before. The vehicle slowed to a stop several yards away. Ethan immediately assumed someone important had taken a wrong turn. Places like this were not destinations for people who traveled in luxury cars. The rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. For a moment, Ethan simply stared. He recognized her instantly. The woman from the bus stop. The woman who had worn his jacket. Victoria spotted him and smiled with visible relief. "I finally found you," she said. Ethan stood slowly. "You found me." She held up the folded brown jacket. I came to return this. Ethan accepted it, surprised by how carefully she had kept it. The fabric looked cleaner than he remembered. You did not have to come all the way out here. Actually, I did. Her expression became serious. There was something inside the pocket. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Immediately, he knew what she meant. The sketch. For a second, he considered asking for it back, but Victoria was already holding the folded paper in her hand. You drew this? She asked. Ethan glanced at the design and nodded. A long time ago. It is remarkable. He laughed softly. It is unfinished. No, Victoria replied. It feels important. Ethan looked away toward the warehouses lining the street. It was supposed to help people. Victoria studied him carefully. What happened? For several seconds he did not answer. Then he shrugged. Life happened. The response was simple, but the sadness behind it was impossible to miss. Victoria sensed there was a much larger story hidden beneath those words. A story connected to the city around them. A story connected, perhaps, to her own company. As they stood there, a warehouse employee walked past and gave Ethan a dismissive look before continuing on. Victoria noticed it immediately. She noticed the van, the worn boots, the careful way Ethan folded the jacket as though it were something valuable. And for the first time, she truly understood the distance between the worlds they lived in. Yet despite that distance, she found herself respecting him more than many executives she met every day. Would you have lunch with me? She asked unexpectedly. Ethan blinked. Lunch. Just lunch. He looked from the luxury sedan to the elegant woman standing beside it, and nearly laughed at the absurdity of the situation. But something in Victoria's expression felt sincere. And for reasons he could not explain, he found himself saying yes. 20 minutes later, Ethan found himself sitting across from Victoria in a quiet neighborhood restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. It was not the kind of place he would have chosen for himself, and he spent the first few minutes wondering if he belonged there at all. Victoria seemed to notice his discomfort. Relax, she said with a gentle smile. It is just lunch. Ethan looked around at the polished wood tables and neatly dressed customers. For you, maybe. The comment made her laugh for the first time since they met. The sound surprised both of them. When the menus arrived, Ethan ordered the least expensive item he could find. Victoria noticed that too. She also noticed the way he thanked every employee who stopped by their table. Small things. The kind of things most people overlooked. As lunch continued, the conversation slowly became easier. They talked about the city, the changing neighborhoods, and the challenges facing ordinary families. Every time the discussion turned toward housing, Ethan became more animated. The tiredness seemed to leave his eyes. He spoke about affordable apartments, community support centers, job placement, programs, and the importance of preserving dignity. Victoria listened carefully. The ideas sounded familiar because many of them appeared in the second door sketch. You really believe housing can change lives? She said. Ethan nodded. I know it can. His expression softened. When people have stability, everything else becomes possible. And that is why you designed Second Door? For a moment he hesitated. Then he reached into his backpack and removed several folded pages. They were older versions of the same project. More sketches, more notes, more dreams. Victoria stared at them in amazement. How long have you been working on this? Almost 6 years. 6 years. Ethan smiled faintly. Dreams do not disappear just because life gets complicated. The answer stayed with her. A waiter refilled their coffee cups and moved on. Victoria looked down at the drawings again. The level of detail was remarkable. Cost estimates, construction phases, community programs. This was not a fantasy. It was a complete vision. Why was it never built? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time since they met, a shadow crossed his face. Outside the window, a ferry moved slowly across the river. He watched it for several seconds before speaking. Because the company that was supposed to support the project changed direction. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. What company? Ethan looked directly at her. Hail Dominion Development. The words landed between them like a sudden storm cloud. Victoria froze. Her family company. Her company. Ethan had no way of knowing how personal the answer was. He continued speaking calmly. Years ago, they acquired the property where the pilot project was supposed to be built. After that, everything stopped. Victoria stared at him, unable to respond. For the first time, she began to suspect that Ethan Miller was not simply another victim of circumstance. Somehow, His story was connected to her own in ways neither of them fully understood yet. And deep inside, Victoria feared that when the truth finally surfaced, it would change everything. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The noise of the restaurant seemed distant now. Victoria lowered her eyes to the sketches spread across the table while Ethan stared out at the river. He had no idea why her expression had changed so suddenly. "Are you all right?" he asked. Victoria looked up and forced a small smile. "Yes, I was just thinking." It was only a partial truth. Her mind was racing through old board reports, land acquisitions, and development projects she had inherited after becoming chief executive officer 3 years earlier. Hale Dominion had completed hundreds of deals. She knew the company had transformed entire neighborhoods. But she had never stopped to ask what happened to the plans that were left behind. "What happened after the property was acquired?" she asked carefully. Ethan folded one of the sketches. "The investors disappeared. Funding vanished. The community organization closed. A lot of people lost faith." He shrugged. Life moved on. Victoria noticed he was leaving out details. The pain in his voice suggested the loss had been deeply personal. "And you?" she asked. "What happened to you?" Ethan smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "I kept working for a while. Then projects slowed down. My wife became sick. Medical bills piled up. After she passed away, everything started falling apart faster than I could stop it." Victoria listened quietly. She could hear the weight behind every word. There was no bitterness in his voice. No anger. Only exhaustion from carrying too many disappointments for too many years. "I am sorry," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." After lunch ended, they walked along the waterfront. The afternoon sun reflected across the river, casting silver light over the city skyline. Victoria found herself enjoying the conversation more than any meeting she had attended in months. Ethan spoke honestly. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not know who she was, and somehow that made every moment feel genuine. As they approached the parking area, a black SUV pulled to the curb. A sharply dressed man stepped out and hurried toward Victoria. Ethan immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. "Ms. Hale," the man said. "The board meeting begins in 40 minutes. Ethan froze. The name echoed in his mind. Hale. For the first time, he looked closely at the vehicle, the assistant, and the expensive watch on Victoria's wrist. Pieces began falling into place. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. She had hoped for a little more time before reality interrupted. When she looked back at Ethan, she saw confusion spreading across his face. "Ms. Hale," he repeated slowly. The assistant appeared surprised. "You did not tell him?" Victoria took a slow breath. There was no avoiding it now. "Ethan, there is something I should have explained earlier." He stared at her silently. "My full name is Victoria Hale." The color drained from his face. He knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. It was on skyscrapers, apartment complexes, business centers, and development signs across dozens of neighborhoods. Suddenly, the woman from the bus stop seemed like a complete stranger. And as realization settled over him, Victoria knew the conversation that followed might change everything between them. Ethan stood motionless as traffic moved behind them and the afternoon wind swept across the waterfront. Victoria Hale. The name carried weight in every corner of the city. It was attached to luxury towers, office complexes, apartment developments, and billion-dollar projects. For years, Ethan had watched that name appear on signs while his own life slowly unraveled. Now the woman standing in front of him was the same person who had worn his jacket at a bus stop only days earlier. "You are Victoria Hale," he repeated quietly. Victoria nodded. "Yes." Ethan let out a short laugh, filled with disbelief. "You could have told me sooner." "I know. Why did you not?" Victoria searched for the right answer. "Because for the first time in a very long time, someone was talking to me without caring who I was." Ethan looked away toward the skyline. Towering above the city were several buildings carrying the Hale name in enormous silver letters. Suddenly he understood why the assistant had looked so concerned. Why the sedan had appeared. Why everyone seemed to know exactly where Victoria needed to be at every moment. She was not simply wealthy. She was one of the most powerful people in the city. "You own half of Manhattan," Ethan said. Victoria shook her head with a faint smile. "Not half." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Close enough." For a brief second they both laughed, and the tension eased. But only slightly. The larger question still remained between them. Ethan looked at her carefully. Did you know who I was before you came looking for me? Victoria nodded. I found your name on the sketch. And then, I wanted to understand why someone with your talent was living in a van. Ethan lowered his eyes. Sometimes life does not follow the plans we draw. Victoria thought about the words. Then she made a decision. I need to show you something. Before Ethan could respond, she turned to her assistant. Cancel my remaining meetings. The assistant looked shocked. All of them. Everyone. 20 minutes later, Ethan found himself sitting inside the back of the luxury sedan as it moved through downtown streets. Glass towers reflected the afternoon sun. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. The city looked completely different through these windows. Eventually, the vehicle stopped in front of the tallest building Ethan had ever entered. The lobby alone felt larger than some apartment buildings. Polished marble stretched in every direction. Employees greeted Victoria the moment she stepped inside. Some nodded respectfully. Others immediately moved aside. Ethan followed quietly, unsure whether he belonged there. Then the elevator doors opened onto the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire city beneath them. Rivers, bridges, neighborhoods, and skylines stretched to the horizon. Victoria walked to the glass and looked out. This is what everyone thinks power looks like, she said softly. Ethan joined her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria turned toward him with a seriousness he had never seen before. Ethan, there is something about your project that you deserve to know. And as she reached for a file resting on her desk, both of them were about to discover that their lives had been connected far longer than either had imagined. Victoria opened the file slowly and placed it on the conference table between them. Ethan stepped closer. The moment he saw the first page, his expression changed. It was a copy of the original proposal for the second door project. His proposal. The same project he had spent years developing. The same project he thought had vanished forever. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. Victoria looked down at the documents. From our archives. Ethan stared at her. You still have it? Apparently, yes. He flipped through the pages one by one. Cost projections. Site plans. Community impact reports. Every detail was exactly as he remembered. Then he reached the final page and froze. A red stamp crossed the bottom. Project suspended. Ethan let out a long breath. I never saw this. Victoria moved beside him. Neither did I. She pointed toward a signature at the bottom. This decision was made 8 years ago. Ethan studied the name. It belonged to a former executive who had retired years earlier. The project was canceled because the land became more valuable for luxury development, Victoria explained. At least that is what the records show. Ethan closed the file carefully. The disappointment he felt was familiar, but seeing it documented somehow made it real again. Victoria watched him closely. There is something else. She handed him another folder. Inside were financial reports, acquisition summaries, and property records. Ethan read silently. The numbers were enormous. Yet one detail immediately stood out. The land originally intended for second door had never been developed. It had remained empty for years. This cannot be right, he said. Victoria nodded. I checked twice. The project was canceled, but the property was never used. Exactly. Ethan looked out the window at the city below. For years he had blamed timing, bad luck, and circumstances. Now he realized something different. The opportunity had not disappeared. It had simply been abandoned. Victoria stepped closer. Ethan, I have spent the last 2 days reviewing everything connected to this proposal. He turned toward her. Why? Her answer came without hesitation. Because I think it was a mistake. The room fell silent. No executive had ever admitted that to him before. No investor. No developer. No one. Victoria continued. When I read your sketches, I realized something. This city has enough luxury towers. It has enough expensive apartments. What it does not have is enough second chances. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He looked back at the drawings spread across the table. For the first time in years, they no longer felt like memories. They felt possible. Then Victoria took a deep breath and made an offer that neither of them would ever forget. What if we built it? Ethan blinked. What? Second door. What if we finally built it? The question hung in the air. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Ethan had spent years imagining those words. Yet now that he was hearing them, he could hardly believe they were real. And deep down, both of them knew that saying yes would change far more than a single project. The proposal should have filled Ethan with excitement. Instead, it filled him with silence. He walked to the windows overlooking the city and stood there for a long time. Thousands of buildings stretched beneath him, each one representing a different story, a different struggle, a different dream. Somewhere among them were people sleeping in shelters, in cars, and on park benches. People exactly like the ones he had hoped to help years ago. "Why me?" he finally asked. Victoria looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Ethan turned toward her. "You could hire the best architects in the country. You could bring in consultants, planners, and development teams. Why would you trust someone who has spent the last 8 months living in a van?" Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up one of his sketches. "Because none of them drew this." Ethan lowered his eyes. "It is just a design." "No," Victoria said softly. "It is experience." She pointed toward the notes written in the margins. Childcare services near the entrance. Job training offices beside community housing. Shared gardens. Counseling centers. Every detail reflected real human needs rather than corporate trends. "Most people design buildings." Victoria continued. "You designed hope." Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. For years he had learned not to expect good things. Hope often hurt more than disappointment. Victoria seemed to understand exactly what he was thinking. "You do not trust this yet, would you?" Ethan asked. She smiled faintly. "Probably not." That honesty made him laugh. For the first time since entering the tower, some of the tension disappeared. Later that afternoon, Victoria arranged a private meeting with several senior executives. Ethan sat quietly at one end of the conference table while presentations appeared on large screens around the room. Property values, construction budgets, project timelines. Numbers filled every slide. Yet as the meeting progressed, Ethan noticed something strange. The executives kept looking at him. Some seemed curious. Others seemed skeptical. One man in particular, the company's chief financial officer, Daniel Mercer, barely attempted to hide his doubts. Daniel reviewed Ethan's worn jacket and simple clothes before turning toward Victoria. "You want this individual involved in a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The room became quiet. Ethan immediately felt out of place. He had seen that look before. The look that judged a person before hearing a single word they had to say. Victoria remained calm. "I do." Daniel folded his arms. "Based on what qualifications?" Before Victoria could answer, Ethan spoke for himself. 12 years as a project engineer. 8 years developing community housing plans. And one very long lesson in what happens when affordable housing disappears. The room fell silent again. Several executives exchanged glances. For the first time, Daniel had no immediate response. Victoria hid a smile. The meeting eventually ended, but the atmosphere had changed. As Ethan and Victoria walked toward the elevator, she noticed something important. For the first time since they met, Ethan was beginning to believe the project might actually happen. What neither of them realized was that Daniel Mercer had already decided he would do everything possible to stop it.